There are microphones at various points in the audience. These don't amplify your voice, but they do help record it for H-France. So when you have comments or questions, please raise your hand. We'll get you a mic, and we'll have at it here. We have the bigger mic to throw at people. No. We'll use this mic, and we'll use the other 3 mics for those in the audience. Gary will wrap a
Please.
Jeff.
Or you can use this one. Yeah.
Do I have to do anything weird with this?
Just have it near your mouth.
I think we need to be a little bit more explicit about the definition of violence. Lynn suggested this, but let's be more clear about it, because I think it helps us see some of the linkages, and I think it works to tie some of the points that this very fine roundtable began. Violence isn't just about killing people or even hurting people. You know, I think that was underlying to some of what we heard, but I think we need to be more explicit. The revolutionary violence includes the destruction of buildings, it includes the damage to the economy, it includes faith. There's a lot of things that get damaged in this, and a lot of violence is done to emotions, to state of mind, to a great deal of both physical and immaterial things that, to my way of thinking, are essential to understanding both the revolution and the role of violence in the revolution. And I think that if we don't recognize that there is a continuum of revolutionary violence that at its height, of course, is the killing of people, that we're missing part of how wide-ranging and how transformative the revolution and its violence truly were.
Maybe it's easier to do it this way. And please identify.
Hi, I'm Christine Wirtz.
No, it doesn't amplify it.
Oh, okay, thank you. University of Texas Pan American, and I just want to just to continue with what you said and what Dr. Hunt said. I was thinking about the student at Rutgers University that committed suicide a couple of years ago, and the public humiliation that student experienced and all that went around that. And I guess my thinking is in the early modern period about how public humiliation is such a part of popular culture, and wanting to know if public humiliation is also something that can be considered as a form of violence, and if it was like increasing, going up with the levels of other levels of violence in the course of the revolution, if you can see that at different moments. It's just a question.
Noah Schusterman. The obvious response that comes to mind to that is the whippings. Tyrania de Maricourt is whipped sometime May, I think, 1793, and that's the end of her as a political player. There are a lot of accounts of nuns being whipped by anti-clerical women. So it clearly, I mean, these are not without violence as well, but both seem to be at play in these. It's very intimidating holding.
But it's broader than that. I mean, the violence to reputation leads to bankruptcies, all up and down, you know, the economy. Violence to reputation is one of the things that helps the fall of the Girondins. I mean, I think that you can certainly talk about this in a both a horizontal and a vertical fashion.
Just going to change the tone a little bit, and I'm mindful of projecting. Thanks, Tim. The question I have, whoa, just one sec. This way. It's a little bit general. But the question is, when is, and for the panel generally, in terms of the revolution, when is violence a valid device? When it's in, sorry, I can't hear you. when is violence a valid device, when it's institutional or when it's popular? Institutional violence always seems to be subjectively condemned. So I don't know if you can comment on that.
I don't know that there were many cases in which popular violence was applauded at the time. I mean, and certainly in the provinces throughout the early years of the revolution, there were many instances of popular crowd violence at moments of bread shortage in particular, and the response on the part of local authorities is always, we need to bring this under control. We need to not, oh, thank God the people are storming, town hall. Let's see what we can do about that. But similarly, I mean, I think the institutional violence as well is viewed as problematic. I mean, I think we do tend to be uneasy about violence in most circumstances, other than perhaps war. So in regard to the public humiliation that Christine asked about and that Noah talked, it is interesting that those instances are principally focused on either women or on priests. I think priests also suffered that kind of public humiliation, which was not, I don't think, of the political violence of the revolution involving that kind of public humiliation so much. Very different in the Chinese case, in which the public struggle sessions and humiliation was an essential part of both the land reform of the early 50s and the 1960s and the Cultural Revolution proper.
I wanted to ask about your statement that popular violence was not approved because where it was declared to be a popular insurrection, then it became the very basis of the revolution itself. The storming of the Bastille, some of the other journées that took place during the revolution were justifying them became part of revolutionary orthodoxy. With respect to the humiliation issue, I was recently reading Donald Sutherland's book on murder in Albania, and he stresses the posthumous humiliation of victims killed by all sides in this long sequence of political killings that go on in the Midi, the mutilation of corpses, the often the other ways in which bodies were insulted after death to add a kind of extra level of punishment. So it's not as absent as, as we might. But on the other hand, to pick up on Jeff Warren's comment in another respect, though, at what point do we make a distinction between violent and non-violent acts? To call somebody something, is not necessarily the same thing as beating them up. That's, I think, an issue we have to grapple with.
Yeah, I'm going to change I think that's a very, maybe the most important question, but I'm going to change the subject nevertheless. So I'm not a historian of the revolution. I'm just, something just occurring to me, and I'm going to ask Lynn maybe to articulate what I can't articulate in a moment. I'm going to state the sort of what seems to me obvious, that the violence in the French Revolution on a global scale over time is no big deal. It's nothing. I mean, I'm teaching now Neo-Assyrians and just mass scale violence going on for 5,000 years. So in that broad world historical picture, the French Revolution, the violence in the French Revolution is nothing. Why is it a big deal? It's a big deal because it was done by people who claim to represent human rights and liberty and are opposed to many of the things that they did. And they believe in values that we hold dear ourselves, and in the name of those values that we hold dear today and that we admire, they were violent and in some cases killed people. So my question is to Lynn, does that make any sense to you? And can you say it better than I did?
No, I'm sure I won't say it better than you have said it. But I think you're coming back to one of the questions that I raised at the beginning, which is essentially that there's violence and there's violence. I mean, part of Jeremy's longer paper, which you didn't have a chance to read, but we'll get to read in print at some point, talks more, for example, about the deaths in the Revolutionary Wars. So if you talk about the effect of the French Revolution outside of France, and Paul kind of mentioned sort of in passing, well, then there's war. The number of people who die in the Revolutionary Wars is infinitely greater than the number of people who die in the political terror. And the number of people who die in the Vendée is also much greater than the number of people who die in any number of sort of other incidents that happened during the Revolution. So that's why I think, for me, it's important to make distinctions about what kind of violence you're talking about. And I think the issue about the violence in the French Revolution, you put your finger on it, which is under what circumstances is it legitimate to use violence to alter the political system on the basis of certain kinds of ideals. And that's what I think is the issue, is how you can go from ideals, and you said this very clearly, to violence. And that's why I think it's very important to have more attention, and I think it's why it's really important now that, like, Jean-Clément Martin has, I think, initiated an attempt to think about violence in a sort of broader context, getting away from why does it happen in one place or to another place, to a kind of more structural analysis of, which Paul was also suggesting, why is the terror so much more violent in certain parts of France than in other parts of France? Why are so many more people killed by extrajudicial and quasi-judicial means in some places than in other places? Now, this is not to deny that there are all kinds of forms of violence that Jeff Horn was bringing up, but I think that certain kinds of violence are particularly troublesome and therefore the subject of political discussion. This is what the Dessaline Massacre is a subject of considerable discussion. James categorically denounced it as the worst thing that happened in the Haitian Revolution, and I think it's a kind of touchstone, the new touchstone for this, and I think, frankly, it should be categorically denounced as a sort of be an action undertaken for reasons that we cannot endorse, eliminating an entire race from a society. So that's why we think about these things, because it has to do with what do we think about current events. And obviously what we think about, and Paul got to this too with the current events issue, I think, not talking about China, but if we go back to the Arab Spring, or maybe it was Jeremy who brought this up, when popular violence becomes an insurrection and actually leads to the change in government, we have a different view of it than we do of just disorderly crowd behavior, the destruction of monuments, whatever. So there's no question that that affects our view. If it actually transforms the government in a direction that we think is desirable, we have a different view of it than we do of pulling people out of the prisons and killing them because they may or may not be spies for a foreign power that has been invented. We have a different view of it. So that's why I think distinctions are extremely important. Because if you just talk about numbers, the wars are by far the biggest issue.
Rebecca McCoy. I was just going to say, again, something that seems maybe obvious, but it seemed like we started the discussion categorizing kinds of violence besides killing. And we've also asked, why it varies across, say, the regions of France or whatever. But I'm also thinking that ultimately it's partly about power. Oh, this is it, okay? Technically challenged. I'm thinking it's about power, and that maybe if you think, it seems obvious, but if you think it about power and getting what you want and enforcing your viewpoint, even if it's for what seems like human rights or freedom, or to maintain the status quo, that is another factor to add in. And I think your point about collective violence still have to process how that might fit in with power, but you have a mob that might be acting more on some collective impulses and emotion. But even so, it is about perhaps power as well.
I think it is often those who feel powerless who carry out what we would consider some of the most egregious examples of popular violence.
Can get what you want sometimes by threats and verbal violence as opposed to killing people. So I think it does explain some of the continuum, just how much you're challenged and how much you want to hold on to power or grab it from someone else or enforce your viewpoint. And if you have, I mean, generally, if you have the means of getting what you want through negotiation, you're probably, a lot of instances, I think, might be more willing, you know, if the situation is right to negotiate, you're not going to all of a sudden kill people.
Well, just to follow up on that, that's always why the slave insurrection has been seen as an unquestionably legitimate instance of violence, because there was no possibility of negotiation. On the other hand, the Dessaline Massacre has raised the question of what we might call gratuitous symbolic violence, because to use the term you introduced a moment ago, power is not an issue. The power question has been settled, but Dessaline decides to make an example of what that means by killing the defenseless whites who are left behind. Yes.
Can I add to that? Yeah, and I also think that this issue of power again comes. There's the issue of how violence is justified and whose power is being enhanced by expressions of violence. I mean, that, for example, the taking of the Bastille becomes a founding moment of the revolution, but throughout 1789 there is a real process of kind of trying to sort of shape that violence and have a sense of sort of channeling that violence. And after Thermidor, there are some popular violence is seen as sort of exceptional and unacceptable, whereas the state sort of turning violence against the populace is an acceptable choice. So it's also who's seizing power and how are sort of the representations of that seizure of power being, I think, manipulated and shaped for particular ends.
So, Matthew Gerber, University of Colorado. I apologize, I've got sort of two questions. But the first concerns the question of justice, because it seems to me, even in the case of Dessaline, you know, what he might argue is this is just payback, right? And that, and in terms of the fantasy of the slave owners before the revolution of slave revolt, the expectation it's coming, you know, to what extent is that based on, you know, a pure understanding of power, and we're afraid of the potential power of this many slaves, and we know that it's our own power that's keeping us in business, and to what extent is it a kind of, is there any sort of consciousness of their own injustice of perpetuating this slave system, and so that they realize if it ever, you know, if the lid gets taken off the pot, you know, we're in trouble because this is just going to blow up in a retribution and judicial violence, as it were, carried out by non-state actors, we might say. My second question has to do with methodology, and I guess one of the things I've always struggled with in any kind of history of violence or warfare or anything is, you know, it strikes me that actual violence is almost impossible for us to get at as historians, and that all we're ever left with is looking at the traces of violence, looking at the effects of the violence, which are already being mediated through, as Laura is pointing out, they're being mediated through various kinds of agendas. And so I'm just curious, maybe Professor Hunt could elaborate on her own project here. How do we get at the emotion that's perhaps guiding the violence, if in fact the violence itself is in some sense inaccessible except for retroactively and filtered through representation?
Well, I think that's a really good question, except it I think, however, is true actually of all historical analysis.
Yeah,
it's
true.
So, I mean, I think it's a good point, and I think that actually that's one of the reasons that violence is both fascinating in a certain kind of horrible way, because we can't penetrate it, but it's also why historians actually usually tend to avoid it as a subject. I mean, one of the things I was trying to draw attention to was that I think for a long time, historians of the Revolution, except for a few in France, in this country in particular, I know it's true of me, have sort of basically stayed away from the violence itself. Now, Jeremy's gotten much more into it now that he's doing the Haitian Revolution. But I think it's, you know, I think we've all have actually a kind of general position, which Paul, I thought explained very well, which is that having studied local places, which most of us have, we don't buy the argument that it's ideological, the violence that occurs. On the other hand, we still don't claim to understand it in some ways either. I think you're quite right. Violence is unrepresentable, but our job as historians is to figure out how to give a good story. And one point about, I think one reason we're bringing it back into the conversation is that, you know, these issues are still very present day for us. The French Revolution is still very present day because the whole question of violence and political change, Gary mentioned 1989, most of Eastern Europe had a very non-violent revolution. Romania did not entirely. So, but that led to certain expectations. Arab Spring has captured our imaginations. So we're kind of back to thinking about what do we want to make of this? Because it has to do with very fundamental questions like, what do we think the place of ideals are? What do we think the place of violence is? When is violence legitimate? We live in a society in which there tends not to be a lot of popular violence now, but one which in the past has been shaped by the popular violence. So I think it's sort of inevitable that it was going to come back on the agenda, and so I think it's really, you know, I think for myself it's very important that I think about it because I spent a lot of time avoiding it in the past.
I'm going to get violent if I can't say something. No, I have this gizmo. Rosamund Duper Hammersley. I forgot what I was going to say. No, I'm kidding. Tacit consent. You said it was, what, a month after the September massacres? You know, so somehow in the silence of this violence, are they accepting it? Begging to differ, and you're way smarter than I will ever be. There is so much contemporary violence, whether it's Rutgers or these morons on the West Side Highway on the motorcycles who ripped this Asian man out of his car a while ago, or Sandy Hook, or any number of schools. And we talk about power. What about rights? Well, the whole militia thing, it's okay to own guns, and we become inured. So maybe they become inured by, you know, even in the summer of 1789, that as a vehicle, it's okay. And somehow we have to make the sense of moving from liberté, égalité, fraternité to the guillotine as a symbol of justice. Because what, it's a clean swipe? Give me a break. So we have two problems. We have a problem just as individuals living in 2013 with horrific acts of violence, public humiliation, and then what the hell are we going to do about the French Revolution?
The French Revolution is a less pressing issue.
Yes, it is. But we still have to teach it.
Hi. So just some of the things, I mean, well, first off, I agree that we do live in a violent society, but less dramatic, certainly, than the one we're discussing. Now, I agree on the need for distinctions, but the more I think about this institutional versus popular violence, the more that seems to disintegrate. I'm not sure I see that much difference between Parisians feeling that they're justified by the decisions made in their section meeting versus soldiers in the Vendée who maybe haven't seen most of their army for a week, for 2 weeks, and are acting at that point largely on their own behalf. Meanwhile, you've got figures like Lafayette, who as a member, as the leader of the National Guard, has a considerable amount of power that he is at first able to exercise outside of the rest of the political constraints until the soldiers themselves stop obeying his orders. You've got the the crowd that's gathered around, the largely army crowd that's gathered around the convention on June 2nd, 1793. So you've got a lot of these situations that don't seem to me to clearly fit into these categories. Which brings back, I think that, Paul, you brought up Weber's definition of the state, and I think that's absolutely key here. But you can also, it's very much a battle for legitimization, a battle for establishing who is legitimate. And I think then one of the questions becomes, is this really a battle? I mean, is legitimacy established by force in Saint-Domingue or in Paris? So I think that Weber's definition is useful as a way of reframing this question.
Yeah, and I think that it's also, I mean, they're linked in the sense that the state is claiming the revolutionaries are claiming the authority to carry out terror as a policy in the name of the people. So there is some relationship there between popular violence and state violence that has to be examined and teased out. So I think that that's essentially very true. And
Robespierre's argument against the trial for the king is that the king has had the insurrection was his trial.
Right. But June 2nd is also an interesting case because that is an insurrection that did not become violent. We have this image of it having been a violent insurrection, but it was not. It was very peaceful.
Yeah, can I just respond on that comment, because I'll confess I did not read the article, but this year the Grawemeyer Prize out of University of Louisville for great thoughts or whatever, but they gave this prize, there's several prizes, and they gave one this year to political scientists who wrote an article that argued that when you look, I don't even know what they looked at, but they made the point that for real political change, lasting political change actually is more effective when done through peaceful means than through violence. Like, they did a balance sheet and basically argued that violence is not an effective means for political change. And I think that, Laura, your paper really helped me think about, and having you sitting next to Lynn Hunt, that the revolution is sort of this moment where we go from ritual violence to political violence, that this is where they're trying to take the old regime, old worldview of ritual violence and redefine it as political. And I just wonder is it possible that violence is, as you're saying, one of these areas where we are not in fact modern yet, that this is a ritual. We call it political violence, but for us it's still some kind of ritual to justify other processes that are taking place. And I think that's an important question to ask, because I do worry about people. I'm sure we all grapple with this, that if violence is used for political change and does do something good, well, you want to support it, but on the other hand, we know, well, who are the people who suffer most from this violence? It's the poor, it's the women, it's the children. I mean, the collateral damage of political violence is so, when I think about that balance sheet, I think it's not worth it. Actually, I'll take stability at those numbers. So that's just something I think we need to think about. To what extent is what we're calling political violence actually productive, and to what possibility is it still ritual, especially in the Arab Spring right now, for example.
I know Scott is one.
Thank you. What I think is so fascinating is the shifts in history that we're seeing. And to get to the French Revolution, I think one thing that casts a big pall over the French Revolution is that in many ways France is at its peak in power in many ways during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. And I think in some ways the fact that France declines hurts the revolution, because it can be seen as somehow causing France's decline. Whereas, if you will, then the Russian Revolution comes in, and many see it as a sort of continuation of the French Revolution, but then that declines. And Sciamma's timing with his book, and of course the bicentennial of the Revolution and the revolutions in Eastern Europe. What incredible historical coincidence. But just to finish, today we're in perhaps the greatest crisis of capitalism since the 1930s. And what this will produce, I think, is very hard to know. But I wouldn't be surprised if in the end the French Revolution gets rehabilitated to a degree. Do you think that's possible?
Did you want to say something? Are you...
I wanted to comment on something else. Why don't you field this one?
First of all, I have to say, I do not believe this article by the political scientists. And I do not believe that the world would be better if everyone just sat back and said political violence never leads to any good because people will be hurt. I am a total believer in the justice of the French Revolution, and I would have to go say further the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. There's no question in my mind that the life of the average Chinese person is better today as a result of the Chinese Revolution, whatever its defects and whatever its regrettable forms of political violence. So I should be very clear about my views on this subject. I am not at all in the camp of those who say, well, you know, revolution is utopian, always leads to bad things, and therefore we should never be in favor of it. I want to go back to the comment about the fact that we live in a violent society. I completely agree with that, but I think the useful way to think about that is, why is American society more violent than most European societies? That, to me, is a more useful question, because I think there are all kinds of things that we could say about the present that we notice violence that we probably wouldn't, that a society like ours might not have noticed 100 years ago, precisely because we have the attention to be paid to isolated incidents like the ones that you mentioned in a society in which, in fact, the homicide rate has gone down dramatically, but is still much higher than the European rates, which are virtually non-existent. So, but the point is, my view is the best thing to do is to try to study what are the reasons for these differences. So I don't think the French Revolution needs rehabilitation, to go to Scott's point, because I think it's obvious that it created a completely different world. And moreover, there's a way in which it's a kind of fruitless question anyway, which is, it happened, and we're not going to go back and make it unhappen. And if we want to draw lessons from it, the lesson would be, I think, that, you know, my lesson that I would draw is, why did we get civil rights in the United States? Because blacks objected to their situation. Why did we get gray rights in the United States? Because there was a Stonewall riot. If we hadn't had mobilization of people, which inevitably creates the possibility for violence, none of these things would have happened. You don't have things happening unless people get together and say, this is intolerable. So it's partly a contest over who gets to decide where the boundaries of the intolerable lie, and there's, you know, so that's too many answers to too many different questions, but I couldn't resist.
Can I build on, oh, sorry, can I just build on this very quickly? Just that I agree that the revolution changed France and the world for the better, and I think in thinking about violence, what I disagree with what you and Paul said about the violence not being ideological in the revolution, that there are local cases in which there is, like the Caen case. But you know, I always find Jean-Pierre Gross's work on economy in the revolution so useful in terms of thinking about the kind of power particular individuals had to operate, to sort of shape violence or to operate ideologically. And in some cases, violence is a search for legitimation. In some cases, violence is ideological. In some cases, there is no violence because there is no ideology. In some cases, there is no violence because there is ideology. And I think that in terms of sort of figuring out what is productive violence, you have to think about what its relationship is to legitimation of particular groups, and what its relationship is to ideology, and whose ideology, and what that ideology is.
Okay. Bill, you wanted to speak.
I just wanted to comment on the fact that many of our speakers have been talking about the dilemma caused by violence for contemporaries, but it seems to me that that is equally true for the revolutionary generation itself, and that there's lots of evidence of the revolutionaries of 1789 agonizing about whether or not they could approve of the popular violence that they so disagreed with but yet had seemed to further their cause. And as cases of popular violence mounted, many of them simply could no longer go along with the project and so fell off the revolutionary bandwagon. But more importantly, Professor Mason was talking about the Thermidorian image. It strikes me that 19th century liberals who were in fact sympathetic to the goals of 1789 had themselves difficulty in persuading their contemporaries that those ideals didn't inevitably lead to the guillotine and to popular violence, and so that beyond whatever dilemma, if as historians people bring up the question of the dilemma for us as in the 21st century, or for questions about whether revolutionary violence achieves aims, surely the revolutionary generation itself agonized over that, and I don't think came with any consensus, because when we talk about the revolution, there would be lots of revolutionaries who wouldn't agree with 1793, but who would passionately agree with 1789. And so if we start to talk about approving of the French Revolution, and that means approving of everything, including the September massacres, and lots of the revolutionaries wouldn't have found that explicable, nor would their successors in the 19th century. So I'm not sure that as contemporary historians we need to say we approve of the French Revolution as a bloc and everything that it included, or we disapprove of it as a bloc and everything it included, because surely there's no better way to say that there's some violence that we might approve of and some that we wouldn't approve of, and surely we're no different than the people we're studying in that.
Please.
I wanted to respond both to you
And
and
then
to
Matthew.
Professor Hunt about the issue of whether political violence is productive. I think that I would agree that there's just times when violence is the only way to bring about changes. I think your point about slavery is a really good case in point, but I think it's productive to think about the consequences of violence as well and how it's not productive. And I work a lot with memory, and I think one of the things that happens with violence is it leaves some pretty polarized memories and very bitter memories, which sometimes creates a cycle of violence and sometimes leads to more violence down the road. It leads to not accepting the changes on various sides of what happened. And sometimes, since I work on Protestants and Catholics and the White Terror and whatever, it also can be an object lesson. There is not much more religious violence after that last spasm. And part of it, my research suggests that it's partly because they're not real happy about what they're remembering and they don't want to repeat it. So it has a number of consequences which aren't necessarily predetermined.
Matthew?
Yeah, just going back to Paul's invocation of Weber, it seems to me one of the potential implications of his formulation is that if I'm a state builder, I'm trying to make a new state, I can't be legitimate unless I perpetuate some violence, right? And this speaks sort of to this question of moments when particular actors are trying to use the violence itself as a form of legitimation, and yet paradoxically, if or maybe not paradoxically, but if you are trying to create something new and you pick your time wrong, then retroactively other people say your violence is precisely what delegitimates you and makes you not proper for government. So look at Gaddafi, for example, who thinks I'm a state, I can protect myself through violence, etc., but all of a sudden has the international community coming down on him because he picked his moment improperly, perhaps. And yet, I guess what I'm wondering is, given that the state itself is arguably a product of history rather than some eternal, form in the cosmos, are there ways of reformulating a state so it doesn't need necessarily to do this anymore, and that states and political legitimacy can be achieved through means other than violence, and that even if it's been the case in the past that there are certainly changes that seem to have only been possible through violence, are there other kinds of changes moving forward that we might be able to achieve without quite as much violence?
Now, I just want to say that Matthew's comment and Bill's comment reminds me that violence is always mediated and represented first in the French Revolution by the journalists who are covering it that day. Every politician seems to, at night, become a journalist and start a newspaper. And the kind of agony you were talking about at one level, Bill, publicly the agony is played out in the press. And I know Jeremy's first work was looking at the right-wing press, who absolutely tried to drive home that these were criminals who were not acting out justice, but who were breaking laws and should be thought of that way. So the history begins that night.
That could be a title.
Well, your question, Matthew, makes me think of the Confucian argument that we can have government by moral example. It never seems to have caught on very well. But I mean, there actually was there is a recorded debate at the end of the reign of Emperor Wu in the Han Dynasty, the debate over salt and iron, over which this is really what's at the heart of the debate. Do we really need these policies that have allowed us to fortify the Great Wall and create an army that will protect us against the barbarians to the north? Or should we be following Confucian precept and letting the gentleman rule and get rid of the army, and the peasants can live independently, and then the barbarians, of course, will come in. So but yeah, it is an age-old argument, I guess.
I'd like to direct a little attention back to that sentence from Slavoj Žižek that Laura read in her remarks, and which was brought to my attention last year by Eric Brandom, who's sitting over there in the corner, and who played a considerable role in getting me thinking about some of these problems. Zizek's definition of subjective and objective violence is both I think perceptive and also very troubling in that I would relate this to Lynn Hunt's comments a few minutes ago, in that Zizek suggests that revolutionary violence is justifiable because it is an answer to the objective and unnoticed violence of existing structures. But the sentence you read almost suggests that the more peaceful a society looks, the more oppressive it must be, since only in that way can violence really be tamped down. And the thing that bothers me always about the Zizek proposition is the tendency, in my mind, to obliterate the difference between violence and non-violence, so that everything becomes violence, and any possibility of making moral distinctions seems to disappear. But to relate that back again to your comments, Lynn, it does seem to me, I would make some distinction between the French, the Russian, the Chinese cases. I think it has become very hard for those of us who work in French history to feel that the level of everyday violence in old regime France was so great that it necessitated a revolution. I think maybe Arno Mayer is the last person to try to argue that in his book, The Furies, where he compares the Russian and Chinese revolutions. In my mind, you can make a stronger case for Russia and China as inherently oppressive societies than you can for old regime France. And to me, that has some impact on my thinking. On the other hand, I said myself, we need to consider the French colonies as part of France, and we need to consider slavery as one of those systems. The fact that it was working on the surface harmoniously in 1789 is indeed an example of what Zizek is talking about. It's not that people accepted it, it's simply that the level of structural violence there was so effective that protest against it was really impossible. But I think, I'm glad you brought that passage into the discussion, because I think it is a very thought-provoking one that can keep you up at night when you're reflecting on these problems.
Well, I think that there's been something kind of lurking, and I want to make it a little more explicit, which is a lot of people are talking about legitimation, but it seems like legitimation is also a process of delegitimizing. So if you legitimate yourself, you have to, using the violence is also a process of delegitimating. And I think that brings in Jeff's point about a scale of violence, right? So first, doing violence to someone's reputation is part and parcel of a process towards physical violence where you delegitimate someone and it becomes okay, perhaps, to use violence. I also think it helps potentially explain Dessaline, right? That once someone is not deserving of any kind of rights, that's one way you legitimate your own rule, but it necessitates, but perhaps the use of violence is not, because it's not only about legitimating yourself, but delegitimating the other people who have had power. You engage in a process where you strip them of the ability to resist. And I think that's what is so troubling to us. And so I think it's important to enunciate that it's not just legitimation. Legitimation always exists in opposition to the former power.
Can I follow up on my comment as well? Because they have a joke in Eastern Europe, which is, what is communism? It's the long, hard road between capitalism and capitalism. And so when we talk about Zizek and about these episodes of violence making visible what's being hidden underneath, I think we have to be careful before we start celebrating them and risking fetishizing them, that we are clear, are they actually productive, or are they rituals that do the steam valve? Oh, yes, we've had our revolution, we'll truck along, but is that systemic violence still there? Because I think as historians, we do see that those structures of inequality do persist. I mean, from Tocqueville we see this, and the abolition of feudalism, let's get rid of this, and then the next thing they're doing is they're reconstructing a social hierarchy. So I think we have to be really careful if we want to, when we're talking about violence, that we're very clear that we're not falling into a false consciousness that could possibly be around violence. So I just wanted to, as my response to your comment.
Any final comments from the audience before I ask the panelists if they have any final comments? Panelists?
I have a final comment. It was just not meant to be the last word. Just to respond to Jeremy, what I found so helpful about Jean-Clément Martin's work was that he pointed out one of the two major situations in which violence occurs. One is the breakdown of state authority, and one is war. War, it generates not just violence intentional, but all kinds of unintentional forms of violence as well. The point about the French Revolution for me is not that that people intentionally got together to replace an oppressive society. The French Revolution happened because state authority broke down. Same thing happened in Russia and China, less so perhaps in the Chinese case. And the difference in the Russian and Chinese case is that you had a party ready to move in and say, thank you very much, we're going to take over state authority. The French case is completely different because no one is expecting a revolution. No one is intending to make a revolution. I am not talking about being in favor of the French Revolution because it replaces an oppressive society. It happened because state authority broke down. You got violence because of the breakdown of state authority. You didn't get violence and then get the revolution. Right. So I think it's very important to be clear on when, again, that's why I think the structural determinants of what makes it possible to have violence occur are very important to keep in mind, because it's not always an intentional, let's be violent and we'll have a revolution and replace oppression. I don't think it usually works that way. It actually works in a quite different way.
If I can say something about sort of explaining violence and representation, both to reply to what you said, Daniela, and also Rebecca, what you said, that I think to explain violence and to understand why it happened, And to say there is a certain rationale here is not necessarily to fetishize it. And I think that that's linked with the problem of memory. The memories of the violence of the terror that emerge after Thermidor they're not neutral memories. They're memories that are constructed, and they're actually memories that make it, I think, almost impossible to deal with the violence of the terror. I mean, if you look at someone like the Antonel, who was a former Jacobin and sat on the Revolutionary Tribunal, in the year 3, Antonel says, yeah, the terror was awful, but there were reasons that the terror took place. We may not agree with all of Antonel's explanations for why the terror took place, but it was a really important conversation to have, and it was a conversation that was becoming impossible because so many other people were saying they were beasts, they were crazy, they were bloodthirsty. So that I think to try to make sense of it, it isn't necessarily to fetishize it. It's to try to figure out what its relationship is in all of these other sort of fields of force.
I might add to that, I think one of the things we learned from the study of historical violence is that it's a human phenomenon, and this is why fundamentally I think the essay you mentioned about the possibility of demonstrating scientifically that violence is ineffective is not convincing. It is, I think, difficult to imagine a human species without the possibility of violence, and we have to live with that. And we can hope to learn from studying history, including the history of the French Revolution, how violence may be limited, how it may be possible to bring a cycle of violence to an end, which is an important aspect of Bashko's interpretation, for example, of the Thermidorian period. It is pointed out by Haitian historians, atrocious as the Dessaline massacres are, that doesn't occur again, racially motivated massacres in Haitian history. They got plenty of other problems, but not that one. I think the best we can hope for is that history might help us reduce incidents of violence. I think it would be utopian to think it's ever going to make it possible to eliminate it altogether.
I think we need to be done.
I know the panel is very grateful for the discussion that you engaged in and for all of your good comments. So thank you very much.